Professor Swart, thanks for making time for us. Good morning. Hello, Mia.
Hello?
Hi, can you hear
Hello,
us,
good
Professor?
morning.
All right.
Yes, I can.
Thank you for making time for us. The 10 West African nationals that have reportedly been forcibly sent to Ghana or by Ghana to Togo, bypassing a formal border crossing and left on the street without passports. What do you make of this, and what implications does this have?
Well, of course, this is a violation of international law on different levels, and it's the consequence of, the US President Trump's obsession with immigration, to the point where he, quite recklessly violates international law in treating, refugees and, other what he would call illegal immigrants in ways that are absolutely unacceptable and violate various international conventions. So what he is currently doing is he's deporting immigrants or refugees to states that will then in turn return those refugees to their home countries, where they will face torture or some other form of cruel punishment or treatment. And this is against one of the most firmly established rules of international law.
Why Africa and not Europe? We've seen this as part of this US deportation program, some deportees being sent to Rwanda, to Eswatini, to South Sudan.
Right. So this has led to some commentators, of course, fiercely criticizing this practice and saying that the US is, treating Africa as a dumping ground for what they would consider, unwanted people. Um, and but in some ways, of course, it also reflects on some African leaders that have entered into agreements with President Trump, with the United States, and have agreed to take these refugees. So I think that shouldn't be ignored, that um, some African leaders are even currently in talks with Trump about, receiving illegal immigrants or refugees from the United States. Um, and this, of course, there's a quid pro quo, there's a form of compensation for this. And this should also be criticized. But in the first place, it's the US that is violating both the 1951 Refugee Convention as well as the 1984 Torture Convention, which is one of the most important human rights documents globally.
Why are African governments agreeing to this program? What could be influencing that?
Well, I'm sure that there are some forms of financial compensation, possibly trade arrangements. Uh, I am not sure what the individual arrangements are, for example, to do with Swaziland or South Sudan or Togo, Ghana. Yes, this is clearly a way for the United States to capitalize on influence that it already has in these countries. It's very disturbing. So far, we've only seen Nigeria, sort of putting its foot down and saying that it will not receive refugees from the United States.
Can African governments refuse to be part of this program? And what would that mean if those African countries said, no, we won't take any deportees?
Of course, African countries have this discretion. Of course, they can say this. They are not beholden, or they cannot, uh, feel that the US pressure should trump international law. They should simply say that this goes against the principle of non-refoulement. Non-refoulement is one of the oldest international principles. It means that you cannot return a person to a country where they fear the risk of torture or cruel treatment. And with most of the refugees returned to Africa via Ghana specifically, Trump has violated this principle. I think he has argued that he's not sending them back directly to the countries where they came from, but to a third country, and therefore he's not violating non-refoulement. But non-refoulement includes the practice of sending someone to a third country, which in turn will then clearly return the refugee to his or her home country. And then there's a whole sort of string of international law violations connected to this, because these refugees were ill-treated in the United States even before. Many of them were ill-treated in the United States even before they were deported. For example, some men complained about going to Ghana or being sent away, and they were beaten and, physically assaulted even before they traveled. So this is certainly, this is certainly against international law and probably even against US law. But of course, we see routine violations of this kind.
This entire issue, Professor, what does it mean as far as the US and Africa's relations are concerned?
Well, it certainly means that the US holds too much influence in Africa if African leaders are so willing to violate their domestic law and international laws in the interest of pleasing the United States. So one would have to delve more deeply into what exactly the financial and other incentives are for states to engage in these practices. And as I said, these are ongoing discussions between the US and African countries. So it's certainly illegal, and it resembles that plan that the UK had to move refugees to Rwanda, which was actually declared absolutely illegal by the European Court of Human Rights and other courts.
We're going to leave it there, Professor. Thank you so much for joining us and talking to us as Channel Africa.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Mia Swart, or Professor Mia Swart, is expert on international law and visiting professor at the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa. Well, we continue with our coverage of news happening in and around